Welcome all. I'm joined today by Ruben Carranza, a senior expert at the International Center for Transitional Justice. Mr. Carranza also served as a former Assistant Secretary of National Defense of the Philippines. The International Center for Transitional Justice is a non-profit which seeks to pursue accountability for human rights violations. So, Mr. Carranza, thank you very much for your time.
I'm happy to be here.
I want to start off with the issue of international tribunals, war crimes tribunals, which you have experience in yourself. In Armenia, legal teams have been gathering evidence with regards to war crimes to do with the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. These are very complex processes. However, they take many years in certain cases until real results are produced. When seeking justice in these international tribunals, especially for war crimes, what are some of the absolute necessities in your mind?
Well, two important considerations for those wanting to seek justice for war crimes and crimes against humanity in an international context is to understand first that you need documentation. And documentation isn't only written documents. It can include testimony, it can include object evidence, evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, everything from ammunition to bodies. But that documentation must, of course, be thorough enough, meeting the standards of evidence that any court, any criminal court would require. But the second most important consideration, I would say, is to understand the limits of war crimes tribunals and war crimes prosecution, especially in the international context. These are courts established by the United Nations or by regional organizations, and they often acquire a political aspect. And I think that political aspect imposes limitations on the kinds of justice that can be obtained in international war crimes tribunals.
And I mean, a lot of the famous cases in international war crimes tribunals, like the International Criminal Court, saw verdict sentences against individuals that were already deposed from power, be it Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, Charles Taylor in Liberia, Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia. We haven't really seen cases of incumbent governments facing, sentences with regards to war crimes. Does that, in a sense, make the whole issue of, seeking justice for war crimes in the Armenia-Azerbaijan context kind of redundant, because you have two governments both in power? Isn't this only really reserved for deposed leaders?
Not necessarily, and I should say, this month, in fact, is the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the International Criminal Court. And I think in the last 20 years, the ICC, to be fair, has evolved from a court that was, in my opinion, justifiably criticized for having focused on African and Middle Eastern defendants in the criminal cases brought before the International Criminal Court. But at least with respect to the previous ICC prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, she did open cases involving Israel-Palestine, for example, or Afghanistan and the United States, or Myanmar, outside of the African continent, and not just involving Arab leaders or African warlords. So there has been some shift towards expanding the kinds of persons and the kinds of war crimes and conflicts that the ICC has covered. But to the extent that many of these defendants, individuals, are ousted leaders or warlords that have been detained or have been captured, you're right. It's difficult for the ICC to go after incumbent leaders or people in power, because number one, the ICC has no police force or enforcement measures of its own. It relies on the member states of the International Criminal Court to enforce its authority. And of course, this is a world in which power, more than justice, determines how much law can be enforced anywhere. So the International Criminal Court, even if it's a 20-year-old court, still has no power of its own to impose, to enforce its orders. But having said that, there are cases in which incumbent leaders in power have been charged at the very least. As an example is Kenya, where the then president of Kenya and one of his vice presidents was charged. Of course, the outcome wasn't satisfying at all to many victims of crimes against humanity in Kenya, or even from the country I grew up in, the Philippines. The just recently outgoing and now no longer president, Rodrigo Duterte, is likely to be one of those to be charged of crimes against humanity for his drug war. So, like I said, there's been a shift that now includes incumbent leaders, but of course, this is a shift towards prosecuting them. Whether they can be tried, whether they will be surrendered, whether their own government will give them up for a trial is a difficult question.
I mean, are there benefits apart from, going after incumbents? For example, in the context of Armenia, many observers were saying that these sorts of international tribunals benefit, like you mentioned, the issue of documentation. It gives also benefits that aren't just about sentencing. Would you agree with that?
I think the larger question here is whether it makes sense to conduct investigations of war crimes and crimes against humanity while a conflict is still going on. And I know that many people will say they should conduct investigations even in an ongoing conflict, perhaps thinking that that might deter those who commit war crimes and crimes against humanity from committing them. But I think there's been enough research that deterrence isn't exactly the outcome of war crimes tribunals and war crimes investigations. The outcome is punishment. The outcome is, to some extent, satisfaction for those who were victimized by these crimes. But the fact is that the world is still a long way from deterring war crimes because someone is prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. And again, that being said, it's important to document the crimes as they are being committed, but it doesn't mean that documentation should then allow you to proceed to investigations and prosecutions as the conflict is going on. That's happening in Ukraine. A lot of Western European countries are putting resources and political will into not just investigating, but conducting prosecutorial action for war crimes being committed in Ukraine. But I do have some reservations about whether that's a wise step to take, given the very political nature of war in general, and particularly the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And you are no stranger to truth commissions and truth seeking. In the context of the Armenian past, be it conflict or other areas, can you unpack what truth seeking and truth commissions would, what they are, what they would mean for the Armenian context?
So the most important thing to say in response is to say that truth commissions are not courts. Therefore, they're not bound by what I said earlier, the legal limitations of documentation and evidence that go into courts. Second, it's important to remember truth as a value in itself, not necessarily leading to punishment, not necessarily leading to the exclusion of individuals for what they do or for what crimes they commit, but to satisfy those seeking truth. And in the Armenian context, not necessarily with the war in Azerbaijan, but Armenia in general has had its own experience with truth seeking and truth telling. ICTJ, for example, was involved in the setting up by a Turkish-Armenian joint body to establish a truth-telling process involving Armenia's history with Turkey. And I think that despite its own challenges, that process was a useful step towards clarifying what needs to be clarified about Armenian history. And I don't see why that can't be studied by Armenians and Azerbaijan activists as well to see how much truth-telling can in fact be used to not just ensure that war doesn't go on, but that many of the issues that have led to this continuing war can be clarified by a peaceful and thorough process that doesn't involve killing young people from both sides. I think it's important for Armenians, and like I said, people in Azerbaijan, they may be exiles, they may be in Azerbaijan. It's important for Armenians, especially post-revolution 2018 Armenians, to help their neighbors understand the value of just going into truth-telling and truth-seeking.
Mm-hmm. And I want to also talk about corruption. In the early 2000s, you were in charge of the litigation investigation in a commission in the Philippines that recovered $680 million of embezzled assets belonging to the family of former Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos. You have also been involved in litigations against the Marcos family that were filed by victims. What can Armenia learn from the experience of the Philippines or maybe other countries, because Armenia itself is going through a similar process. The government in Armenia came to power in an anti-corruption platform and has said repeatedly that it seeks to bring back assets that were embezzled. So what can Armenia learn from these experiences?
The most important lesson from the Philippines, and perhaps from many other post-dictatorship countries, is to remember that ousting an authoritarian government isn't the end of accountability. You have to take the next steps towards ensuring that they don't come back to power, or that if they try to come back to power, that they don't have access to the ill-gotten resources that they stole in the first place. That's an important lesson, because now in the Philippines, even after all the efforts at recovering the assets of the Marcos family, and even taking steps to use some of those assets as funding for reparations for victims of the Marcos dictatorship, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the dead dictator, has been elected president. Of course, the story is a bit more complicated. There's disinformation, there's social media, which we've seen in Armenia is also being used to revise the history of Armenia, at least the more recent history of Armenia. And I think it's important also to look at combating disinformation, combating the use of social media platforms using ill-gotten wealth. So there's a reason why you have to go after ill-gotten wealth. It's to make sure that those who committed corruption in the past don't use the resources they stole to come back to power, and it's to ensure that they don't use these resources to fund disinformation to help them come back to power or get impunity for what you want to do with them and hold them accountable for.
So it was really the ill-gotten resources that possibly allow certain political forces that were once in power to campaign, to fund political campaigns. But how exactly can, a government or authority stop that from occurring if it's done in a legal way?
And by legal way, we're really talking about the fact that this information on social media is unregulated, and that it's subject to a balancing effort that's very difficult to do. Because on one hand, you have freedom of expression and freedom of speech. But on the other, you have new platforms in which this information can run rampant, and those who have the most money can buy the most number of lies and have them spread. We've seen this in the United States. We've seen this in South Korea. We've seen this in Eastern Europe. We've seen this in so many countries where authoritarian leaders use social media platforms not just to have themselves elected, which means they're democratically elected, but to then ensure that their opponents, those seeking accountability, activists, for example, are subjected not just to disinformation, but to repression, to violence even. And the danger here is that if we err towards ensuring free speech and free expression by simply allowing this information to run rampant, we're also paving the way for this information to lead to anti-democratic processes that basically ensure that political forces can no longer operate freely in your own country.
Mm-hmm. And the part of the way to retrieve ill-gotten resources is by having a healthy judicial system, surely. You once said in the Armenian parliament, the judicial institutions in Armenia are largely composed of many of the same judges and investigators that allowed institutions to be abused. Armenia must look for reforms that are far-reaching. How would you assess the judicial reform process in Armenia thus far? Do you have any recommendations? What do you think about this subject?
That has always been one of the first questions many Armenian activists and also Armenian policymakers ask me when it comes to discussing judicial reforms. Can we go after the corruption and the human rights violations committed by previous leaders before courts whose judges were appointed by or are very close to these former leaders? In other words, what do you do first? Do you change these courts? Do you reform these institutions of the judiciary and the prosecution and then prosecute, investigate? Or do you hold prosecutions? Do you do investigations even as you conduct judicial reforms? And it's difficult to talk about sequencing and timing without context. Many of the countries we've worked in for ICTJ, we've seen that the most effective judicial reforms are those that are undertaken as soon as possible after a transition has happened. One, because there's a lot of political will. Number two, because there's a lot of support for those reforms from people who are involved in the transition, whether it's revolutions or elections. And third, because you will have people willing to serve a government that comes into power fresh with a mandate that's undisputed. The longer you take to do judicial reforms, the timing becomes more difficult. The sequencing becomes more complicated. You'll be accused of favoring the party in power. You'll be accused of being selective about who you appoint, and even your new appointees will be suspected of serving partisan interests instead of becoming icons of reform. So for Armenia, I'm not saying it's too late, but I'm saying it's important to do this as soon as possible. And some of the quick steps that can really be taken now is to ensure that there's public civil society participation in judicial reform rather than just leaving it to politicians and to policymakers.
And in terms of the judicial system, the Armenian government wanted to overhaul the judicial system, but it received a lot of criticism for the handling of this issue. A referendum was called, and then it was called off. Certain tapes were released which made the government look very bad. It made it look like it was trying to get rid of judges in a very threatening or aggressive way. How can one go about this issue in a way that's ethical, democratic, and stays true to human rights?
Well, I think it's also important to not discount the fact that those who will be affected by judicial reform will resist judicial reform. And that resistance isn't going to be simply public resistance. It can be underhanded resistance. It can be resistance done from behind, secretly, undermining the mandate of those who seek judicial reform. So it's important to understand that criticism of judicial reform will somehow appear as legitimate, will somehow invoke human rights and transparency, but are really motivated by impunity. But it's also important to see that many of those who often fund judicial reform measures or demand that judicial reforms be done by a country such as Armenia are countries that have unrealistic expectations of what can be done sooner rather than later, or what can be done in a country that hasn't really experienced democratic participation for decades. Many of the European Union countries, for example, that fund judicial reform measures set standards that they feel are European standards, but don't necessarily reflect the capacity and resources of countries in the region, such as Armenia. And I think it's important for European Union countries to understand that transitions define the extent to which you can undertake reform, how radical your reforms can be, and how much it can be supported. And a revolution in 2018 surely should be reason to revolutionize how reform can be done, that you can't simply do it the Eastern European Union way of carefully and slowly changing institutions as if there will be no resistance, as if there will be no effort to prevent change from happening.
Okay, Mr. Carranza, thank you very much for your time.
I'm happy to be here, and thank you for having me here.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.